In this presentation, I'll be discussing of Cannibals by Michel de Montaigne. The key terms that I felt like I should discuss is skepticism, which is the attitude of doubting knowledge claims set forth in various areas, and pedagogy, which is the study of methods including the aims of education and the ways in which such goals may be achieved. So, some background information of Michel is that he was born in Chateau de Montaigne on February 28th, 1533, and then he died on the 23rd of 1592. During this era, there was a big decline in intellectual optimism. At an early age, he was tutored by his father about pedagogy, and when he grew up, he studied law at the University of Toulouse. And then after college, he entered magistrature like his grandfather and fulfilled many positions. After that, he retired into a castle, dedicating his life to reading, meditating, and writing. And from that, he produced essays. His first two books were published in 1580. And it was so captivating that he kind of painted his self-portrait of his ideas and opinions, and some essays along with Augustine and Rousseau. He was honored by King Henry III and King Henry of Navarre, and he finally finishes his essays in 1587. And again, he dies due to inflammation of tonsils. And he also had kidney stones, which discouraged him from a career that his father offered. So about the essays, it was written during the era of dissimulation, corruption, violence, and hypocrisy. And with all the negativity going on, Montaigne responded in skepticism. And with his essays, he ties it with events, personal experience. He shares his views and opinions on humankind. He highlights the weakness, failures, and imperfections of Cannibals. This was during the French expedition to South America in 1557. He reserves egocentric European belief. He studies the nature of natives, and from that he compares and contrasts to the nature of Europeans, and is similar to Herman Melville's type of peep at Polynesian life. The discussion questions I came up with is, what is Montaigne's argument about philosophy and the desire for knowledge? What faults do humans have with reason, with the eye of reason? And how does water analogy integrate with Montaigne's discussion? What is the importance of it? So Montaigne acknowledges knowledge, that we accept what we're taught by others based on their experience and the fact that we haven't experienced it. So an example is King Cyrus' invasion of Italy. He's heard from Greek individuals that Italians were barbarous, but the thing that went wrong was when he actually went there, they weren't as what he was told that they were, so they weren't barbarous. Also, he acknowledges that knowledge has nothing to do with superiority. Depending on where a person resides and the nature and community he resides in, you really don't need to know that much. Which is also a disagreement with Plato and Lycurgus on the desire for philosophy and more knowledge. So we judge things by what we see, what he calls the eye of reason. An example is that the Europeans define native as savage and barbarous based on what they saw. And on a side note, like Europeans and Greeks, they define other nations as barbarous, so sometimes we have to just take that into consideration. Like, anyone but them are barbarous. He also says our eyes are bigger than our bellies, and I took it as our eyes are so big that we just judge by what we see, and we don't have the appetite to actually dive in and study more about what we are viewing. He also tells us that humans tell stories and tailor them from how they appeared to us. So they want us to look at their stories by their lens when there's a whole nother picture or story behind it, which is why he feels like there are not that much wiser men out there, if that is the case. He talks about a water /river analogy, which is a story from Plato, and basically he's talking about an island called Atlantis, which is a big country or a big island that contains more countries than Africa and Asia put together. But the kings of those islands were so greedy, you could say, that they wanted to expand and conquer more lands like Spain and Italy. And they were going for Greece, but the Athenians tried to stop them. But before any of that happened, a massive flood came through, and the water created rivers and separated the land, in which he feels like it was a wonderful change. I feel like there's a lot of connections that could be made. The kings are the Europeans being really greedy, going to other countries and taking their land, and the flood that happens is a wonderful change to the earth because it separates individuals so they could create their own culture, their own community, and different ways of life. So the nature of things. Nature produces things at her own rate. So the reason why natives are not as advanced as Europeans is because nature is very slow in their progress, or it's at like a halt, whereas nature isn't really there anymore for the Europeans, but it's like their progression is very fast, which is why they're on different levels. All things, says Plato, are produced either by nature, by fortune, or by art, the greatest and most beautiful by the one or the other of the former, and at least and most imperfect by the last. This was a very challenging quote, but I took it as nature is one of the most greatest and beautiful forms of all things, and nature enforces, I guess, fortune and art. So everything happens from nature, but what nature creates is also fortune and art, which creates. Individuals, especially European, feel like they're more superior over nature, which is why they would strip their land or their art, like gold, diamonds, and cast away from her works. So imperialize things. Laws of nature governs, and I took that as nature governs its creations, like the natives, which also talks about their progress too. The lifestyle that Montaigne observes is the South Americans were simple with their life, and they're pleasant and temperate, which is why it was rare to see sick people, toothless people. There are many landscape and fresh produce, and in contrast, Europeans were more colonized with buildings and everything, so they weren't really engaged with nature as the natives were. And they believed immorality of the soul, and they're polytheistic, which Europeans didn't really look into because they just believed, they just thought out of the bat that they had no God. Montaigne feels like war defined their barbaric characteristic because the wars were bloody and messy, but they were very courageous because they did not know what running away was. And the barbarism comes from the enemies. They would trophy their enemies' heads, and when they captured them as prisoners, they would eat them as revenge, not for nutrition. But the difference between the Europeans and the natives were that they weren't doing it out of greed. It was for a noble cause, to defend themselves for the most part. Along with honor, again, in wars, they would fight for their tribe, and they would never run away or subdue to anyone. Even women with polygamy, they honor their husband. They want what their husband desires, and in exchange, the husband will honor them by taking care of them. And they also, Montaigne also gives an example in the Bible about Jacob. So going back to the Europeans, Montaigne feels like they believed they were superior and perfect in every way, which is why they scaled everyone to their standards. And because they weren't at their standards, they were looked upon as different and less than what they are. And he also acknowledges that because they find certain things like the savagery and barbarism and wars in the natives, it blinded them from their own nation, because again, the Europeans killed and mercilessly killed the natives and raped their women. So the fact that he acknowledged, the Europeans acknowledged other faults in European natives, it blinded them from their own faults, which shows ignorance by meaning and the characteristic of corruption. So the bigger picture, why it matters, and my closing thoughts is that we humans tend to focus on others' faults than our own moralities. Our own faults. We see things, we may view things and state it for what it is, but it's always not going to be correct, which is why we have to, I guess, seek more. But at the same time, philosophy and the desire for knowledge is not necessary. And you can relate that to the natives. They did not need to know how to, build brick homes when they just needed to know how to build wood with wood. So I guess knowledge on a certain level is based on the nature of where one resides in. So some knowledge is not necessary, which is also why he disagrees with Plato and Kyrgyz of obtaining more knowledge.